Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. So I've been inspired recently to make videos discussing the most important games in my life and the memories I have from them after watching the podcast by Lauren Kay, which is the Games That Made You podcast. The first game we're going to talk about is Final Fantasy VIII. Beware of potential spoilers for Final Fantasy VIII incoming. So from the back of the box, a member of an elite military team, Squall, is forced into a conflict beyond imagination. To survive, he must contend with a desperate rival, a powerful sorceress, and his own mysterious dreams. So it's the 8th entry in the series, pretty obviously, and follows the classic Final Fantasy semi-turn-based combat, complete with ATB gauge, summoning monsters, magic, physical attacks. Limit breaks, which were introduced in Final Fantasy VII, also make a return. I grew up in the UK, and the first Final Fantasy game that we got was Final Fantasy VII in 1997. I didn't get a PlayStation 1 until Christmas 1998, which was sandwiched between the release of Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VIII, released in 1999. So 1999 was kind of the year of PlayStation for me. I used to collect the official PlayStation magazine primarily for the demo disc that came with it, because back then as an 8-year-old, outside of Christmases and birthdays, it was difficult to get hold of a new game, so the demos were a godsend. So when you would read these magazines, you kind of get insider stories about games and stories about developers and like urban legends about things and rumours about games that may or may not come out in Europe. Sometime, I think in early 2000, a friend of mine started talking about a little game called Final Fantasy VIII. Now, like any obnoxious 9-year-old, I was like, well, how can it possibly be final if there's another 7 games? This friend promptly told me that 7 was the only one that had come out in the UK, and it wasn't worth playing. We're no longer friends. So back at that age, obviously, we used to run around the playground pretending to be characters from certain games and TV shows, and of course the names of characters like Zeldincht and Squall, Leonhardt and Quistis Trape and places like Galbadia and Trabia were fascinating names, and they just sounded so unusual, not like a lot of other entertainment I was experiencing at the time as a kid, which was very much like lots of names were based off of puns or colours and things like that, and they didn't have that kind of real world feeling vibe. And also I learnt about the weapon which was called the Gunblade, which is basically what it sounds like, which is a gun and a sword put together in one item, which is the coolest thing in the world, and I would still say that I would rather have a gunblade over a lightsaber to this day. So naturally, after talking about this for a while, I had to go over his house and see the game being played, and he'd gotten to the missile-based part. What he managed to do at this point in the game is he managed to get Diablos to summon, so I just sat there in the battle using the summoning magic monsters, the GFs, to attack various enemies on the way to the missile base. It was mind-blowing, absolutely incredible. On par with anything in a film at the time. So obviously Star Wars Episode 1 was the big film of that year, which had the pod race in it, which was amazing. And you also had lots and lots of TV shows, even kids TV shows emulating the Matrix with all the bullet time stuff. So, you know, special effects in films and TV shows are incredible. But seeing like the summoning monster of Diablos coming out of some like gravity ball was just incredible. It was like you're playing a film. And I think it still stands up as being, you know, a watershed moment for graphics and games. So my friend also had the official Final Fantasy VIII guidebook. Now, what was great about this guidebook was that it had all the screenshots from the game. It had like all the names of places, the bestiary, all the characters has been described, how to beat all the enemies, absolutely everything you could think of was in this book. So at lunchtimes at school, he'd lend me this book so I could read through it, and it was great because I could like write down all the characters' names. I remember frantically on the back of my notebook writing down the names of the places so that I could remember what they were, and I would write stories about these places and stuff like that. And I even like named some characters from a story I was writing at school after the characters from Final Fantasy VIII. And it was an incredible way to connect with a game that I hadn't been bought yet, and I'd only actually played once. I could like be part of this world without actually experiencing the game in the flesh. I remember before I mentioned the official PlayStation magazine. Issue 44 of this official PlayStation magazine, which I have here, had a little feature on Final Fantasy VIII, and for some reason this particular magazine was left on the shelf in my newsagents. This is bearing in mind this is early 2000 that I was playing this game for the first time, and the issue 44 of the official PlayStation magazine was sat on the shelf for months and months and months. And of course, I wasn't particularly interested in that particular volume because it had driver and cars on the front of it, which wasn't really my thing at the time. But when I'd learned about Final Fantasy, I noticed in the bottom corner of this magazine is the picture of Squall, and it talks about a Final Fantasy VIII exclusive. If you open up the magazine, and it had like a first impressions thing, and it had basically the team at official PlayStation magazine had a hands-on exposure to the game, the Japanese version of the game, and they had all sorts of screenshots from it, and they were comparing it to Final Fantasy VII, which was obviously the big deal at the time, talking about all the characters and making theories about who the characters were and how it was going to relate to the last game they'd played. And all the screenshots of the characters and the GFs and the other stuff in the game was just incredible to look at. Now, I really wanted this magazine, but at the time I couldn't afford it. So what I did, which is really silly thinking back, considering the fact the magazine had been sat on that shelf for a year and clearly no one wanted it, was I hid it behind some fishing magazines and then went home, and I think the next week I got the pocket money I needed to come in to the shop to buy the magazine, went behind the Fisher magazines, it was there, no one had taken my precious magazine, and I took it home. And I can't overstate enough how important it was to be able to connect to this world I'd kind of fallen in love with by, you know, talking about the characters, playing as the characters and things like that. Even got a cap gun I had and connected it to like this plastic sword and like duct taped it up and made my own gun blade because I was a cool kid. So it was incredible to actually have something, a physical piece of media, even though it was just a magazine that, you know, was supposed to like market a game. It was incredible to sort of actually have something that was mine, like even if it was just pictures and things like that. It shows some merchandise of Final Fantasy VIII. The one that I remember the most was the memory card wallet, which was basically like a CD tray. You could fit 4 memory cards in it with the Final Fantasy VIII logo on it. There was the Final Fantasy VIII figure of Squall, and there was a lanyard. I'm amazed that the magazine's in such good condition after all these years, to be honest with you, because I read it so much. Now, I haven't ever been in the shop game sometime after this, and I really wanted to see if I could get Final Fantasy VIII. This is before Christmas. Final Fantasy VIII was the grand price. This was, bear in mind, this is 2000, of $29.99. I remember the guy in the shop saying $29.99. We couldn't go any lower than that. And at the time, I'd been like, my mum and dad had been good or something, said that they'd give me £10 towards something. And what you could buy there, and I remember this is amazing, there was a shelf just lined with copies of Final Fantasy VII, and it was £15. And I had like £5 to spend. So I could, actually, if I'd wanted to, bought Final Fantasy VII there, but this friend had told me it wasn't very good. And actually, I'd read the back of the box, Final Fantasy VII box, and I thought, well, this doesn't look anywhere near as exciting as Final Fantasy VIII, which was something I was so desperate to play. So I didn't buy anything. I can't remember, I must have bought some sweets or something. I don't really remember what they were. But I didn't buy Final Fantasy VII that day. Final Fantasy VIII is the only one. I can't have anything else. It's got to be this game. So move forward to Christmas Day 2000, and eventually I finally got my copy of Final Fantasy VIII, which was like a big present for me that year. And I think other than maybe the actual original PlayStation, it's probably the best present I've gotten for Christmas. Obviously, like, my PlayStation was in my room, so my little TV in my room, I could play on the PlayStation with all the games I had. But the cool thing about Christmas was that as long as I kept the living room tidy, I was allowed until New Year to keep the PlayStation set up. So I remember playing to the Dollet mission in Final Fantasy VIII. The opening cutscene was incredible. The attack on Dollet with the music and the landing and all that stuff was just absolutely amazing. And fighting the Evolret at the top of the tower was just... I remember sitting in my living room, well, I think probably New Year's Eve 2000, fighting the Evolret and seeing Squall, you know, jumping up and attacking it. And it was just like, you know, I can't believe I own this game. It's incredible. It's like Pokemon for grown-ups because you're playing as real human beings. You've got monsters you can summon, but there's a real story that I can relate to. Now, I had no idea what I was doing in this game originally, of course, because Pokemon was the big game. So everyone just used to be like fighting monsters with each other. So I thought, well, what I'll do, because these summoning magic things look so good, is I'll just keep spamming the GFs over and over and over again and attack the enemy. So that only got me so far because I had no idea about how to use the junction system. And my friend had told me at the beginning, oh no, you don't need to bother with these tutorials. They're a waste of time. The game notoriously gives you tutorials at the beginning of the game and explains how you use the junctioning system. So I had no idea about the junctioning system and played the first half of the game without junctioning magic to any stat, which is something that people do in challenge runs these days, so I guess maybe I was good at that back in the day. So I played the first, I think it was probably the first 2 discs of the game, just using GFs and occasionally using limit breaks. I remember that learning the boost feature on the GFs, where basically if you would hold select and then like hammer square really, really quickly, what would happen is that it would boost the GF's power, because the GF's default power was at 75% efficiency. And during the cutscene, which was like sometimes like a minute long, you could use that time to hammer it up to maybe sometimes 130, 140% if you were really, really quick, which I got really good at. The thing about playing Final Fantasy games, for me anyway, was that I didn't necessarily need to complete the game to feel immersed in the world. I think it was probably about 3 years later that I actually finally beat it. And I remember having a real resurgence in playing this game in, I think, probably 2003, something like that, where another separate friend who I'd got into the game turned around to me and was like, you do realise that you can junction magic to attributes and it makes the game easier. So what had happened is I'd been stuck. I got all the way to the Ragnarok section of the game where you go into outer space and you have to fight these monsters called propagators, and they're a nightmare because you've got to beat them as pairs. So there's 4 different colours of propagators. There's purple ones, red ones, green ones and yellow ones, and there's 2 of each, and you have to kill the green one first, followed by the second green one, and they've got to do it in a pattern, otherwise they respawn. And because I was so used to like doing this GF method, they were nigh on impossible to beat this way, and I just got stuck because you're stuck on the Ragnarok. You've only got 2 characters, and that's it. I left the save file there for probably years until my friend said, no, you can junction magic to your attack. What I ended up doing is eventually going back to the save file, actually like putting magic on junctions, and then the rest is history. I beat the game later that year. Because I'd gotten stuck at this point, I'd like restarted the game about 3 or 4 or 5 different times and got through the first disc, you know, multiple times, slightly different ways, junction different GFs to different characters or use different parties and things like that. So I know the first disc maybe, or disc and a half of that game very, very well. To this day, it's probably the game I've sunk the most hours into because I've played it so many times. Of course, that experience of beating the first part of the game so many times has made it extremely memorable. Again, proving the point you don't have to necessarily beat a game to really feel part of it. So memories from playing the game, the first thing that really stuck out to me was the original soundtrack. I had this soundtrack and I remember learning all of the different names of all the tracks and what they corresponded to. So the pieces of music that stuck out to me was a song called Dead End, and it plays initially when you're running away from the big spider at the end of the Dollet mission. It plays at the parade at the end of the first disc. Squall's theme, The Oath, which is basically like this, big stringed instrument piece, which is like, explains Squall's character. He's a deeply lion-hearted person. The landing theme, which plays when you approach Dollet for the first time, is absolutely incredible. The battle theme, obviously the Final Fantasy Victory Fanfare is incredible. I think every single song in this game is incredible. Probably the best piece of work that Nobuo Uematsu's done. I think it is his magnum opus, because I don't think there's a single track on here I don't like. So the characters are incredible in this game as well. So the initial setting is a place called Balam Garden, which is like it's a cross between like a military base, but also like a high school. So the main character is Squall Leonhardt, who's like a typical emo type character, but he's a much deeper character than he lets on. Zell Dinched is the sort of loudmouth, in-your-face type character who's your fighter. For itself, he's like a crazy, zany girl, but deep down is very, very emotional, is emotionally affected by quite a lot of things in the story. Quistis is your instructor at the beginning of the game. She's only like a year older than you. She's only like 18 years of age. So she has to balance off the sort of like responsibility of being in charge, but also trying to fit in with her own age group, which is an interesting dynamic. You later meet a character called Irvine Knies, who is kind of like a sharpshooter and like a self-professed ladies' man, but actually he's a bit shy when it comes down to it. Seifer is Squall's rival, who is kind of like this hopeless romantic person, really wants to go and be the sorceress's knight, and he's clearly lived watching films and wants something more with his life. So they're the main characters, and they're all seeds, but they're all part of the garden complex. They're all military type people. The only other one of the main characters that's playable is Renoa, who is the main love interest of this game. She's not in the military, but she's part of like a resistance faction. So she's clearly capable and tough and everything like that. She's kind of like an outsider character. So what's really, really cool about this game is that all of the characters are sort of archetypes of like teenage, early 20s, angsty people, but they're all relatable in their own way, because everyone sort of has their moments of being a bit angry. Everyone has their moments of being a bit secluded, like Squall. And some people are really zany on the outside to cover being deeply emotional. Some people feel like they're older and more responsible. Maybe they have a young sibling and can relate to someone like Quistis. There's something for everyone in this game from the characters, and I think it's probably the standout point of the game. The way that the dialogue was presented was quite interesting for the time. So at the time, obviously, voice acting was quite uncommon in games. We had games like Crash Bandicoot and Spyro the Dragon and stuff like that at the time had voice acting. Because this game was so big and there were so many different voice clips that would have been needed, there wasn't enough space to do that. So the way they got around this kind of limitation was by like having grey text boxes being spoken by the person out loud, but having like thought bubble type see-through text boxes that were explaining what was going on in Squall's head. So you could also choose options to this as well. So like sometimes like if someone were to say something to you, you could either choose to be really rude to them, ignore them, or be quite polite to them. So you could kind of change Squall's personality based off what your mood is, which was pretty interesting to do at the time. You get a magical lamp in this game, and the magical lamp at the time that everyone knew about was a magical lamp in Aladdin, which summoned a genie who was Aladdin's friend. Whereas in this game, you rub the magic lamp and the devil pops out, and you fight the devil in like a shadowy world. And he's probably one of the hardest boss battles in the game. I can beat him quite easily now because I've played him so many times, but I think I remember sinking hours into this guy trying to beat him as a kid. And eventually, after trying over and over and over and over again, you beat him and you can summon him, and it's an incredible experience. I remember it really stuck out. It was the first time I really thought I'd achieved something in a game, because if you read the guidebook, it says this is really hard, don't try this till later on in the game. It's something that's optional content, you don't have to do, but I did it and I felt like, wow, I've actually, gone the extra mile and, beaten something in this game. And of course, Diabolos is probably still the best GF in the game. He gives you the best abilities as well. He's great. The time travel aspect of the game is incredible. So basically during the story, the characters I talked about before would fall into like a dream world where they would wake up and be playing as older characters. And as it transpires, these characters are in a different time. So you're not really time traveling, you're kind of like traveling into their memories. I think that the main character in this, Laguna, who's the character that you go into, probably a character that could have had his own game. He's my favourite character in the game, and he's kind of in a sense a side character because obviously he's not one of the main cast. But the idea is that he's like this military guy that wants to just go and live a quiet life, but actually his drive to protect people he cares about is more important to him than what he wants to go and do, because he wants to go off and be a journalist and travel the world peacefully. But he's drawn to battle because people that he's close to keep getting threatened. So he's a bit of a dutiful person, a really interesting character. And I think if there was any other content about Final Fantasy VIII made, I think a spin-off about him and his journey would be absolutely brilliant. The game's kind of got like a creepy vibe about war and sorceresses through it as well. So there's like 4 or 5 different antagonists who are all kind of the same antagonist. They're being possessed by one sorceress, and the whole idea idea is this world's like a post-war world where there's been a war with the sorceresses. So the time you're going back to with Laguna is before the big war. So you can kind of see the contrast when you're going back to this sort of post-war world. One of the things that people say about this game, which is kind of like, you know, people are critical of, is that like you're saving the world as teenagers. But actually it's interesting because it's sort of like a symptom of the world they're in. It's clearly it's a post-war world. So well, actually it makes sense because like clearly like lots of people have died in this war. You see the before the war storyline with Laguna and the characters he interacts with, and you see the after war and the effect it's had on these young characters who are all orphans. Bit of an interesting contrast. I also remember that the Lionheart ability, which is Squall's final limit break, is incredible because basically what the Lionheart is it's what Squall charges up an attack and then strikes the enemy for like massive damage I think it's about 30 times. And I remember what's interesting is the guidebook mentions this ability, but it doesn't explain what it is. But it doesn't really explain to you how to get the limit break. It tells you, but it's not something that's bigged up in the guidebook as something you need to do. So I remember like by accident getting Squall's final weapon when I was younger towards the end of the game. And then randomly the Lionheart ability came out at the end of a limit break chain. And I saw the ability itself. And I just remember being like sat there with my jaw on the floor thinking this is the most incredible thing in the world. The reason it was so important was because no one had told me about it. It had been mentioned, but I'd worked it out on my own. It felt like it was my thing. It felt like a super duper secret. And I remember introducing this part of the game to my friend at school, explaining to him how to do it. He got it, and then I said, I'm not going to spoil with you what it is. You have to find out for yourself. And it was great because I'd introduced a game someone else had introduced me. I'd introduced something from that game to somebody else, and it just felt like it was mine all of a sudden. But I think the best part of the game to me that sticks out as the most emotionally resonant part. The theme of Squall's character is that he's quite a loner, but he's deeply affected by events from his past. Now, he's actually deep down a bit of a soft touch, but has this image of being quite hard-faced throughout the game. And of course, you know that when everyone else around him doesn't necessarily know it. And there's a point in the story where Squall's thrust into a leadership position, and it's actually quite a funny moment where he's given the Tannoy, because he's been in charge of the garden as a military base, and he's given the Tannoy to give a speech as the new leader. And he goes, I'm not going to give a speech, haha. And of course, all the characters laugh that it's really funny that, you know, Squall, this sort of emo character, doesn't want to give a speech, and isn't that typical Squall, ha ha ha, it's really funny. And then later when you go for your what is supposed to be the final assault on Galbadia Garden, your rival garden, there's a moment where the Oath Squall's theme plays, and Squall, without anyone asking him, gives a speech completely from the heart, and it plays with all the other characters coming along, moving around and reacting to it. And of course they're not reacting joking about him, they're reacting in a, oh my god, that's our friend way, and he's taken charge and he's enabling us to move forward into the unknown. And you see this massive move from the beginning of the game where you're this lonely kid to the end of the second disc of the game where he's taken ownership of his own destiny. Incredible moment. I think it sticks out as probably the most emotionally gripping moment of certainly the game, but I think the Final Fantasy series. I think if I feel down, I will still put that scene on, and the moment where the Oath, the first 3 bars of the Oath music plays, still gives me goosebumps now even thinking about it. So in conclusion, this game is really important to me. It introduced me to a lot of RPG tropes, introduced me to a lot of fantasy tropes, introduced me to a real engaging story, a non-comic story in games. So Final Fantasy is always about people that are sort of thrown together and make the best of the situation they're in and go off on an adventure and save the world. It's pretty standard, you know, storytelling in general, but in Final Fantasy, they're always a quirky bunch that are unlikely and come together. Whereas in Final Fantasy VIII, the characters all grow up together for the most part, apart from one. So it's almost like their destiny is to go and save the world. It's almost, you know, even it's said in the game, their destiny is to beat the sorceress. They're not flung together, they choose to be together, which is very, very interesting, different dynamic. And I think the kind of contrast between the pre-war story with Laguna and the post-war story with Squall is something I think would really benefit from a remake. I think out of the 3 classic Final Fantasy VII, 8 and 9 on the PlayStation 1, I think 8 is probably the one that probably needs to be remade the most so that the story can be experienced in a different way. But of course there are people that are more qualified than me about the subject of Final Fantasy VIII that you might want to hear talk about their love of the game too.
I always love an excuse to talk about Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy VIII in particular is quite close to my heart. It's one of the first Final Fantasy games I played, the second one I played immediately after 7. I think Squall is the one protagonist who, at the time I was playing the game, really felt like I resonated with the most, because he's just a miserable guy, isn't he? He's a miserable guy who doesn't speak very much, and that sort of like resonates with me quite a lot. He's inside his head a lot, isn't he? And he spends most of the game sort of not really expressing himself properly and saying how he feels, and I particularly enjoyed his story, his personal arc through that game as he sort of is encouraged by his friends to come out of his shell. And, it sounds a little bit cheesy, but like his relationship with Renoa as well, how that blossomed, like, I thought it was fantastic. On top of that, I think Final Fantasy VIII has some of the strongest set pieces in Final Fantasy history. In particular, the Dolet mission right at the start when they're going in for their seed exam. The music, and they're all sort of attacking the beach in those boats, and how it transitions from like a CG cutscene into like in-game graphics, like so seamlessly. I remember at the time that was like the big thing, right? Like it was like CG cinematics, and then it would just... There's that whole bit on the train as well, where you're literally playing a CG movie as the in-game sprites sort of like try and input these codes and everything, and that was like, it was so groundbreaking at the time. And even now, I think the visuals hold up. There's the infamous dance scene with Renoa and Squall that even to this day looks absolutely beautiful. Everything about that game was fantastic. Absolutely banging boss theme. The final boss track is actually my single favourite piece of Final Fantasy music of all time. It's called The Extreme, and it's when you're fighting Ultimisia in her final form. That piece of music, I just think, is absolutely phenomenal. It's Uematsu at its absolute best. So yeah, an outstanding JRPG, a game that is very close to my heart, and one of, if not my favourite, Final Fantasy protagonists in school. So yeah, phenomenal game.
Final Fantasy VIII, let me take you back. Final Fantasy VII was the game that got me into RPGs and the Final Fantasy series. So of course, when I started seeing posters and I started seeing kind of trailers for Final Fantasy VIII, I was excited and knew I was going to get it. I didn't know what I was getting into, but when I started playing that, I absolutely loved this game. A few key memories from back when I was playing it for the first time on the PlayStation 1 was, of course, the Dolet mission, the music, just the overall atmosphere and the epicness of that scene as you go in, and the smooth transition from cutscene to in-game, straight like that, was mind-blowing at the time. A few other shout-outs was, of course, the garden becoming a mobile kind of vehicle to traverse the world, and then crashing into Fisherman's Horizon and introducing me to the greatest track of Final Fantasy VIII, in my opinion. Now, a few things that kind of mean a lot to me now that I've gone back to it, especially recently, is Squall as a character. When I was a kid, I thought this guy was a very, very moody man. But as I've gotten older and gone through my own life experiences and played Final Fantasy VIII again, I've noticed why Squall spends more time in here than out there, and watching that progression and watching the struggle was really relatable, and in my eyes, really make Final Fantasy a great game and a great story that is telling when it comes to its characters, especially Squall.
Yeah, Final Fantasy VIII, it was my first Final Fantasy, so I think you tend to build a stronger connection with your first Final Fantasy. It's like that sense of wonder. And for me, when I played it, I was 15, 16. So for me, it was almost like I was exploring the world with Squall and with the party as they go into the world from the garden. So that sense of exploring the world was, it gripped me. So and obviously all the beasts and the GFs and whatnot, it was my first kind of fantasy game, so all of that was brand new to me. Loved all of it, and then I explored all the Final Fantasy series up to that point after I played it. So yeah, will always have a place in my heart.
Who's your favourite character?
Selphie.
Oh really?
Yeah.
Because she's crazy. She likes playing things like the rocket launchers, yeah.
She's crazy, but somehow she's probably, apart from Squall, the next most capable person in the party, I feel. Yeah, she's amazing. Everyone should have a friend like Selphie.
I was fortunate enough to discover Final Fantasy VIII in the same year it was released, way back in 1999. Back then, I was addicted to Final Fantasy VII and had played hundreds of hours over the previous 2 years since its release. So when I heard there was another one in the franchise, I was beyond excited. Luckily, I was given it as a present for Christmas in 1999. I remember being mesmerised by the opening sequence. I had never seen anything like it at the time. It looked so different from any game I had played. and I was immediately obsessed. The visuals, the gameplay, the music, the story were all just incredible and revolutionary to me at the time. I fell in love with the game almost instantly, and I still love it to this day. I still have the original game and guidebook I was given that Christmas, and I also remember spending countless hours drawing the characters from the guidebook and reading it cover to cover, trying to know everything about the game. A favourite memory of mine is actually playing the game with my mum. We didn't watch much TV, but instead we spent most evenings and rainy days playing the game together, as we had done with Final Fantasy VII. These are the memories I'll always cherish, and it's the reason that Final Fantasy VIII is one of my favourites in the franchise.
The first time I played Final Fantasy VIII, I was a teenager in high school back when the game was still new, so probably around 2000. I borrowed it one disc at a time from a friend because I had never played any of the Final Fantasies up to that point, and this was new and kind of big. Later on, as I wanted to OP myself, I borrowed a strategy guide from a friend. I then lost that strategy guide, had to replace it. That's how long ago this was. I was able to actually go to the store and find and buy a copy of the Final Fantasy VIII strategy guide. Later on I found it, so I still own it to this day. This very same copy from high school over 20 years ago. God, I'm old. My only experience with Final Fantasy up to that point had been I'd watched a friend play a little bit of 7. Mostly he was just racing and breeding chocobos to get the Knights of the Round materia in Final Fantasy VII. And I knew that Aerith died in Final Fantasy VII, though at that time we were still calling her Ares because we didn't know any better. So when I was playing through Final Fantasy VIII, I thought that Final Fantasy had a motif of the love interest dying, perhaps. So every time Rinoa was in danger, I was legitimately preparing myself for her death, expecting to be really sad and whatnot. But fortunately that never came, but it did add another layer of emotion, intensity, whatever, to the game when I played through it the first time. As far as what keeps bringing me back, I play it every couple of years since then. It's probably just the story, the world building, up to the point, yep, you know, when I first played it, that was the first time I'd ever played a game that was that intense and sweeping in its world building. You know, I'd played things like Resident Evil, which are great, but those take place, you know, on Earth in America. This is a completely different world that they had to basically build up from scratch, using assets from other games, obviously. That's kind of what they've always done. I love that about it. You know, the graphics are still pretty solid at this point. Like, looking back at them, you wouldn't necessarily think it was a 20-year-old game on the original PlayStation, but it, you know, the cutscenes anyways, the rest of it's pretty pixelated. Besides that, the other thing that I really like gameplay-wise is the junction system. I know it gets a lot of crap from a lot of people for being confusing and convoluted. Once I got the hang of it in my first playthrough, like, it's basically God mode turn on. It's one of the most complete kind of character building methods in a game that I've played. Like, usually if you pick a character, like, that's what you're kind of stuck with. You know, in this game, you don't really pick what character you want to play. You're given them, and then through the junction system, you can kind of fly in the face of whatever predisposition each character has towards combat style and just make them your own. And at the time, it was pretty in-depth. One of the most in-depth character building systems that I had seen up to that point, and I still love it, and it's one of the reasons I still come back and play this game every year or so.
Hi guys, author MJ Gallagher here. I personally played Final Fantasy VIII at release. I was maybe about 13 at the time. One of the biggest things for me, as you might imagine, is the story. I absolutely loved the sort of mix of modern fantasy, sorcery, and a bit of sci-fi thrown in as well. But off the back of Final Fantasy VII, which is my real passion in life, obviously Final Fantasy VIII was a step up in graphics, particularly realism. But the thing that really jumped out at me was the soundtrack. I think Nobuo Uematsu just took everything to a whole new level with Final Fantasy VIII. Even today, it remains one of my favourite soundtracks ever, and probably within the entire Final Fantasy series. Laguna as well was a real highlight for me. I love his character, sort of how much of an idiot he is at times, but also how strong his moral compass is, and sort of where that takes him later in the story. I love the journey that he goes on. It's wonderful. Probably the biggest thing for me in Final Fantasy VIII though was because of the age I was when I was first playing. It was around about the time that I was starting to take a real interest in girls. So the romance between Squall and Rinoa kind of hit me pretty hard. I felt that the game itself really captured the sort of teenage awkwardness, particularly sort of expressing your feelings towards those that you like, those that you love. And Rinoa herself is just a fantastic heroine. She's very strong-willed, very clear about what she wants. So it was nice to have a story where the female love interest is not playing hard to get, sort of thing. As a sort of a young guy, being able to see how she nurtures Squall in his personal growth, that was really cool as well. And one of the other things is really the dynamic between Squall and Rinoa's relationship and how that compares to Laguna and Julia. I'd never seen anything like that done before in a story, and probably not since either. There's a real beauty in the loss of Laguna and Julia's relationship, and the sacrifice that they make, and so that the next generation, the attraction is rekindled there. It's really bittersweet, but I think it's a wonderful way to tell a love story. But yeah, that's me. That's what I love about Final Fantasy VIII.
Final Fantasy VIII was my very first video game. I got it for Christmas. The year it came out, and I was inseparable from it. It has informed so many of my interests for me, getting it and playing it from a very young age, and it certainly shaped my development and my interests going forward. I cannot think of a more beautiful game in its small details, the fading and blurring of scenes as you move between them, and the intricate camera angles. It's a masterpiece.
Well, the thing about Final Fantasy VIII is I was introduced to Final Fantasy because of Final Fantasy VIII. Basically, my brother Bobby was playing it at his house one time, and I literally saw the Dalit mission with Quistis with the machine gun shooting this giant spider, and I thought, I have to have this game. So basically, I can thank Final Fantasy VIII for introducing me to such a brilliant series that legit changed my life.
Hello.
Hello, would you like to talk about Final Fantasy VIII and how it's the best game ever made?
Would I like to talk about Final Fantasy VIII? I absolutely would like to talk about Final Fantasy VIII. Best game ever made. I would give anything to do a modern 4K Balan Garden. I also think the junction system was not that complicated, but in terms of like the world and the character and the music, it is for me the peak of Final Fantasy. It is the one that made me a Final Fantasy fan, and the one that made sure I wanted to work in games, so it's the best.
The memories that will always stick with me in terms of Final Fantasy VIII, I will always remember the proportions of the characters and the overall aesthetic of the game. I talked more in detail in my review, but basically what it made me feel like I was playing a movie. You have to understand, like, at that time, none of the games really felt like you were playing a movie, aside from maybe Metal Gear Solid. And because the characters were a little less anime and a little more realistic looking and proportional, no sprites, all the characters were present on screen at all times, I was able to more or less engross myself in the game a lot more because of the proportions of the characters. And of course that's all aesthetics, right? But as I played the game, what I really started noticing was I was able to connect and identify with pretty much all of the characters. And I gotta be honest, ever since then, I haven't played a Final Fantasy in which I identified with every single character. Just the mere fact of Squall and Rinoa actually embracing and this very tender moment occurring in the game was something that I hadn't seen in a Final Fantasy game, really. You know, again, with the proportion of the characters, you can more relate to characters becoming close to one another. And that's another thing that, you know, I really appreciated about Final Fantasy VIII is that, you know, they went into romance a little bit harder than this sort of ambiguous sort of shyness thing that you would see in a lot of Japanese titles. And so it was refreshing to see two characters actually like connecting on a romantic level. Final Fantasy VII had iconic weaponry with the giant Buster Sword, these giant obnoxious swords, just how big can we make a sword? Let's just make all. And I was, you know, even before 8 came out, I was always wondering, like, how can you top a giant blade? It's a sword. You can't top it. It's impossible. Well, there is a way to top it. Just get a sword and a gun and put it together. You know, one thing that was also really cool and I touched on my video was, like, I was going to high school at that time. The environment of 8 and the environment of just a regular kid going to high school, like, I could connect with that. You're in a classroom, the first part of the game. Like, I don't know, just something I really connected with. And I will always remember when I first playing it, it's like, oh wow, it's like I was just there. I was just in class like 2 hours ago. 8 will always be my favorite for a variety of reasons. And I will always cherish it. Back to you, Jack.
Yeah, so I'll leave it there. Thank you for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments. See you later.